The foundation of Mather's $200 an ounce concealer couldn't quite hide the violet bloom on her cheek. But as she cracked the eggs into the pan, she wasn't crying. She was preparing a meal that would either end her marriage or save his soul. Welcome message. Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. I am Mr. Zaha. Thanks for tuning in today. A kind words from a man who has seen it all. Marriage are not mostly bed of roses. Sometime you need more of. More of what? Can't say. Continue watching, and you will surely know what to do in situations like this. Kindly hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Tomorrow, I'll be bringing you another exciting story you definitely don't want to miss. So let's get started. The sun rose over the Manhattan skyline with an indifference that felt like a personal insult. From the 68th floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, the world looked like a sprawling circuit board of gold, silver, and glass, buzzing with the frantic energy of 8 million people. None of them knew that inside this particular glass tower, a monument to American success and architectural prowess, a heart was beating its last rhythm of hope. Mather stood before the vanity mirror in the master suite, a room larger than the entire apartment she had grown up in. The marble of the vanity was cold beneath her fingertips, a sharp contrast to the heat still throbbing in her left cheek. She moved with a practiced, haunting stillness, the kind of economy of motion learned only by those who have spent years trying to become invisible in their own home. She looked at her reflection. For a long time, she simply stared, disconnected from the image. Where there should have been the vibrant, laughing woman Joshua had married 10 years ago, there was a ghost. Her skin was sallow, and her eyes, once described by Joshua as emeralds in the sun, were now dull and clouded with a permanent, low-grade fog of anxiety. Then, there was the mark. The bruise was a deep, angry plum, a jagged nebula of purple and blue that bloomed across her cheekbone and drifted toward her temple. It was the physical evidence of last night's incident, the moment the scotch, the stress of a failed acquisition, and Joshua's simmering sense of entitlement had collided into a single, devastating movement of his hand. She didn't touch it. To touch it was to acknowledge its reality, to admit that the man who had promised to protect her was the one she now needed protection from. Instead, she reached for her armor. Mather opened a drawer lined with velvet. It was filled with the world's most expensive cosmetics, bottles and jars that cost more than a family's monthly groceries. With a steady, clinical hand, she began the ritual. First, a cooling primer to soothe the swelling. Then, the heavy-duty, stage-grade concealer. She dabbed it on with a sponge, layering the pigment with the precision of a Renaissance painter. Step by step, she erased the truth. She watched in the mirror as the violet faded, replaced by a flawless, peach-toned mask. Perfect, she whispered, though her voice cracked. The billionaire's wife is back. As she finished her makeup, the memories of their early years began to bleed through the silence. Before the Joshua Miller brand was a global powerhouse, they were just Josh and Mather. They had lived in a fourth-floor walk-up in Brooklyn where the radiator clanked like a dying engine and the smell of the nearby bakery was their only luxury. Back then, Joshua had nothing but a laptop, a fierce intellect, and a way of looking at Mather that made her feel like the only solid thing in a shifting world. He had been her hero. When her father died, Joshua was the one who held her through the night. When she failed her bar exam the first time, he was the one who filled the apartment with post-it notes of encouragement. But wealth, she realized now, didn't just change your lifestyle, it changed your soul. It acted like a magnifying glass, taking the smallest seeds of arrogance and insecurity and growing them into towering, poisonous weeds. She stood up, her silk robe rustling against the floor. She needed to be downstairs before he woke. Joshua hated a house that wasn't in motion. He liked to wake to the sound of productivity. As she walked down the grand spiral staircase, the silence of the penthouse felt heavy, almost liquid. The walls were adorned with modern art, abstract splashes of red and black that looked like wounds. This home was a museum of their success, but there wasn't a single framed photograph of them laughing. Every image was a professional portrait, staged and lit to project power, not love. Before we go any further into the dark corridors of Mather and Joshua's life, I want to ask you, have you ever felt like you were living a double life? Like the world sees one version of you while you're breaking inside? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever had to be strong when you felt at your weakest. It helps the community know they aren't alone. Mather entered the kitchen, a cathedral of stainless steel, sub-zero appliances, and white quartz. Usually, by 6:30 a.m., the household staff would be humming about. Mrs. Higgins would be prepping the green juice, and Elena would be polishing the silver. But last night, in the wake of the shouting, Mather had sent them all away. She had used the excuse of a private anniversary weekend, a lie they had swallowed with polite, knowing smiles. She needed the house empty. She needed to feel the weight of her own choices without the prying eyes of employees who whispered in the pantry about the moods of Mr. Miller. Mather walked to the pantry and bypassed the artisanal granolas and the imported papayas. She reached into the very back, behind a row of expensive oils, and pulled out a heavy, seasoned cast-iron skillet. It was an ugly, black thing, out of place in this sterile kitchen. They had bought it at a garage sale in Vermont during their first year of marriage. Joshua had joked that it was the only thing in their kitchen that was tougher than his ambitions. For years, it had been the centerpiece of their Saturday mornings. But as the billions rolled in, the skillet had been relegated to the back of the shelf, replaced by copper pans that were beautiful to look at, but held no history. She placed the skillet on the high-end induction cooktop. The clink of the iron against the glass rang out like a bell. She began to cook. This wasn't just breakfast. It was a sensory reconstruction of a different life. She pulled out thick-cut bacon, the kind that filled the air with a smoky, salty haze. She cracked eggs into a bowl, not egg whites, not the heart-healthy scramble Joshua's trainer demanded, but real, golden-yolked eggs. As the bacon sizzled, the sound triggered a memory so vivid it made her dizzy. 6 years ago, the first big windfall. Joshua had come home, picked her up, and spun her around the tiny Brooklyn kitchen. "We're done, Mather. No more debt. No more cold winters." He had kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of sweat and triumph. That night, they had cooked bacon and eggs in this very skillet, sitting on the floor because they had already sold their old kitchen table to make room for the move to Manhattan. How had that man, the man who cried with joy because he could finally buy her a real engagement ring, become the man who looked at her with such contempt last night? The shift had been gradual. First, it was the long hours. Then, the work trips to Vegas and London that he stopped inviting her to. Then came the smell of perfume that wasn't hers, florals and musks that clung to his suits like a betrayal. When she finally gathered the courage to ask him about the rumors in the tabloids, he hadn't denied it. He had simply looked at her and said, "I provide a life for you that 99% of the world dreams of. Don't ruin it by being inquisitive." The emotional abuse had been a slow poison. He began to critique her clothes, her weight, the way she spoke at dinner parties. He isolated her from her friends, suggesting they were low class or after his money. By the time the first physical flash of anger happened a year ago, Mather was already so diminished she believed she had somehow provoked it. She turned the bacon, her hand trembling slightly. The heat from the stove was making the concealer on her face feel heavy, like she was wearing a ceramic mask. Then, she heard it. The rhythmic, heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs. Joshua's footsteps. In the early days, those footsteps were the best part of her day. They meant her partner was home. Now, they were the footsteps of a predator. Each thud on the mahogany stairs echoed in her chest. Her instinct was to shrink, to check the mirror one last time, to make sure the bruise was truly hidden. But today, she stayed at the stove. She didn't turn around. Joshua entered the kitchen. Even in the morning, he was an imposing figure. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit, the jacket off, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal a watch that cost more than a suburban home. He smelled of expensive sandalwood soap and the faint, lingering acidity of the scotch he'd used to wash away his rage the night before. He didn't speak. He walked to the island, picked up his iPad, and began scrolling through the pre-market trading numbers. The silence between them was a living thing, thick, suffocating, and jagged. "Where's the staff?" he asked, his voice a smooth, cold baritone. He didn't look up from his screen. "And why does it smell like a greasy diner in here?" Mather took a breath, feeling the air catch in her throat. "I sent them home, Joshua. I wanted to cook for you." He finally looked up. His eyes were sharp, calculating. He scanned her face, his gaze lingering on the area of her cheek where he knew. He must know. The bruise was hidden. There was no apology in his eyes. There wasn't even guilt. There was only a flickering annoyance, as if she were a piece of furniture that had been moved out of place. You cooked. He let out a short, dry laugh. We have a Michelin-starred chef on payroll, Mather. I don't have time for a trip down memory lane via cholesterol. You used to love this, she said, her voice sounding far away to her own ears. She began to plate the food. 2 eggs, over easy. 3 strips of bacon. Sourdough toast, burnt slightly at the edges, just the way he liked it in 2014. She walked over and placed the plate directly on top of his iPad. Joshua froze. He looked at the plate of common, simple food, then up at his wife. The audacity of her interrupting his work was clearly a shock. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking. Mather, he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous register that usually preceded a storm. Move the plate. Now. No, she said. It was the first time she had said that word to him in 3 years. She sat down across from him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. In the harsh, unforgiving light of the Manhattan morning, she sat with her painted-on face and her broken heart, and she forced him to look at her. About last night, Joshua began, his tone shifting to a transactional sort of apology. I was under a lot of pressure. The Holloway deal is falling through. You shouldn't have come into the study when I was on the phone. It was an accident, Mather. You tripped. The lie was so blatant, so rehearsed, that it felt like a physical blow. I didn't trip, Joshua, she said softly. And you weren't on the phone. You were looking at photos of that girl. The one from the marketing department. The one who's 24 and thinks your money is a personality trait. The silence that followed was absolute. A bird hit the window on the 68th floor, a dull thud, and fell away. Joshua's face transformed. The billionaire facade cracked, revealing a raw, ugly vanity. Is that what this is? A breakfast of grievances? You think because I've been distracted that you have the right to interrogate me? Look around you, Mather. Look at this floor. This art. Your closet is full of clothes you didn't earn. You live in a palace I built. If I want to find distraction elsewhere, that is the price you pay for this life. He reached out, grabbing her wrist across the table. His grip was like iron. Don't ever mention her again. And don't ever think you're in a position to judge me. Mather looked down at his hand on her wrist. A year ago, she would have cried. 6 months ago, she would have begged for forgiveness. But today, something was different. The breakfast wasn't just food. It was a tether to the woman she used to be. The woman who wouldn't have stayed for a second with a man like this. Eat your breakfast, Joshua, she said, her voice eerily calm. Because while you were building this palace, you forgot one thing. And what's that? He sneered, releasing her wrist with a flick of his hand as if she were contaminated. You forgot that a palace without a foundation is just a very expensive pile of rubble. And I'm the only foundation you have left. She stood up and walked to the counter, picking up a small, white envelope she had hidden under a tea towel. She didn't give it to him yet. She just held it. Joshua looked at the eggs. They were getting cold. The yellow yolk stared up at him like accusing eyes. For the first time in a decade, he looked genuinely unsettled. He wasn't used to Mather standing her ground. He was used to her being the soft place he landed, the person he could vent his frustrations on without consequence. What's in the envelope? He asked, his voice losing some of its edge, replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity, or perhaps, for the first time, fear. Mather didn't answer immediately. She walked to the window, looking out at the city. From here, everyone looked like ants. Everyone looked small. The next 60 minutes, Joshua, are going to be the most important hour of your life, she said, turning back to him. You can eat that breakfast and remember who you were, or you can walk out that door and find out exactly what happens when the foundation decides to walk away too. The act ends with Joshua staring at the simple plate of food, the steam finally stopping, as Mather stands by the window, the light hitting her face just right, revealing the faint, unmistakable outline of the bruise through her expensive makeup. The battle lines were drawn. The billionaire was about to meet the wife for the very first time. The silence in the kitchen was no longer empty. It was pressurized, like the cabin of a plane losing altitude. Joshua looked at the plate of eggs and bacon as if it were a bomb. He was a man who dealt in high-stakes negotiations, who could stare down hostile boards of directors without blinking. But this simple breakfast, this ghost of a meal, was doing something to him that a billion-dollar lawsuit never could. It was bypassing his ego and hitting the raw, unrefined memories of his youth. Mather didn't move from the window. She watched him through the reflection in the glass. She saw the way his hand trembled, just a fraction of an inch, before he reached for the fork. "You think a nostalgic breakfast fixes last night?" Joshua asked. His voice tried for its usual venom, but it came out hollow. He was leaning on his arrogance because it was the only tool he had left. "You think you can guilt-trip me into being the man I was when I was broke? That man didn't have a legacy. That man was a nobody." "That man loved me," Mather replied, her voice reflecting off the cold glass. "And more importantly, that man liked himself." "Can you say the same thing now, Joshua? When you look in the mirror, do you see a legacy? Or do you just see a man who has to hit his wife to feel powerful?" The word hit hung in the air like a physical object. Joshua flinched. He finally picked up the fork and took a bite of the eggs. The taste was an immediate, violent assault of memory. It wasn't the refined, truffle-infused palate of his current life. It was the taste of salt, iron, and cheap butter. It was the taste of 2014, the year they stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about changing the world, fueled by nothing but caffeine and each other's company. He chewed slowly, the mechanical action of eating forcing him to swallow the reality of what he had become. I don't like who I was last night," Joshua muttered, his eyes fixed on the plate. It was the closest he had come to an admission of guilt in 5 years. "Then why did you do it?" Mather turned around, walking back toward the island. She didn't stay at a distance this time. She leaned in, forcing him to see the mask she had painted on. "Was it because I caught you? Or was it because you've become so used to getting everything you want that the moment someone reminds you of your humanity, you try to crush them?" Joshua pushed the plate away. The screech of the ceramic against the quartz island sounded like a scream. "I have a lot on my plate, Mather. You have no idea what it's like to have 5,000 employees' livelihoods resting on your decisions. You have no idea what it's like to have the SEC breathing down your neck while you're trying to close the biggest deal of the decade." "I used to know," she reminded him, her voice rising in volume for the first time. "I was there for the first 3 deals. I sat in that cramped Brooklyn office and proofread your contracts until my eyes bled. I wasn't just the wife back then, Joshua. I was your partner. You didn't start leaving me behind because I couldn't keep up. You started leaving me behind because I knew where the bodies were buried. You started leaving me behind because I reminded you of the guy who actually had a conscience. Before we dive deeper into this confrontation, I want to hear from you. Have you ever seen someone change for the worse once they got a bit of power or money? What do you think is the biggest test of a person's character? Share your thoughts in the comments." Joshua stood up, his chair skidding back. He was a foot taller than her, a broad-shouldered silhouette of power. "You think you're so innocent? You've enjoyed the private jets. You've enjoyed the diamonds. You didn't complain about the conscience of this company when we were buying this penthouse. I would trade it all for a night in that walk-up," Mather said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I would trade every diamond I own for one night, where I didn't have to wonder whose perfume is on your collar or if I'm going to have to hide a bruise the next morning." She reached for the white envelope she had been holding. Her fingers gripped it so hard the paper began to crinkle. "What is that?" Joshua asked, his eyes narrowing. "Divorce papers? Is that your move? You think you can take half of what I built because I had a bad night?" "It's not a bad night, Joshua. It's a bad life," Mather said. She didn't hand him the envelope yet. She held it against her chest. "Inside this envelope isn't a divorce filing. Not yet. Inside this envelope is a choice." Joshua let out a harsh, cynical laugh. "A choice? You're giving me an ultimatum?" "Mather, I'm the one who gives orders. I'm the one who decides who stays and who goes." "Not today," she said. She opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of photographs. She didn't show them to him all at once. She laid the first one on the table. It was a photo of the 24-year-old girl from his marketing department, the one he thought he was hiding. But in the photo, she wasn't at work. She was entering a medical clinic in Midtown. Joshua's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. "Where did you get this?" "I didn't need a private investigator, Joshua. Your distraction isn't as discreet as you think. She's been calling the house. She thinks you're going to leave me for her. She thinks you're the hero in her story." Mather laid down a second photo. This one was a screenshot of a bank transfer, a massive sum of money from Joshua's private account to an offshore entity. "This is embezzlement, Joshua, or at the very least, a massive violation of your fiduciary duty to your shareholders. You used company-linked funds to buy her silence about the pregnancy, didn't you? The air in the kitchen vanished. Joshua felt like he was drowning. This was the breakfast she had served, a meal of his own secrets, seasoned with the evidence of his downfall. "Mather, listen to me," he said, his voice cracking. He reached out to take her hand, but she stepped back as if he were made of fire. It isn't what it looks like. I was handled. She's trying to blackmail me. I was protecting the company. I was protecting us. Protecting us? Mather's laugh was a jagged, heartbreaking sound. You hit me last night because I walked in on you looking at her sonogram. Joshua, you hit me because for a split second, you felt the weight of the lie you were living, and you couldn't handle the fact that I saw it too. She threw the rest of the photos onto the island. They scattered like autumn leaves, images of his infidelity, logs of his hidden accounts, and finally, a photo of her own face from 3 months ago, featuring a different bruise he had forgotten he'd caused. The breakfast was to remind you of the man you were, Mather said, her tears finally breaking through the barrier of her makeup, leaving dark streaks through the concealer. The photos are to show you the monster you've become. Joshua looked down at the images of his own depravity. The luxury of the kitchen, the $50,000 coffee machine, the view of the empire he had built, it all felt like it was rotting around him. For the first time, the billionaire looked small. He looked like a frightened boy caught in a lie that had grown too big for him to manage. "What do you want?" he whispered. He sounded defeated. The fire that had fueled his rage the night before had been extinguished by the cold, hard facts on the table. "I want the man in the Brooklyn apartment back," Mather said. "But that man is dead. So now, I'm settling for the truth." She walked over to him, and for the first time, she didn't flinch. She reached up and took a damp paper towel from the counter. With a slow, deliberate motion, she began to wipe the makeup off her cheek. She scrubbed until the peach-toned cream was gone, revealing the full, ugly, violent reality of the bruise. She leaned in close, so close he could smell the bacon on her breath and see the reflection of his own horrified face in her pupils. "Look at it, Joshua," she commanded. "Don't look at your stocks. Don't look at your deal. Look at what your hands did to the person who loved you when you had nothing." Joshua tried to turn away, but her words held him like a vice. He looked. He saw the swelling. He saw the way the skin was broken. He saw the physical manifestation of his own soul's decay. A low, guttural moan escaped his throat. He sank into the kitchen chair, the same chair where he had sat 1,000 times to ignore her, and he put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he choked out. The words were small, pathetic things. "I don't want your sorry," Mather said. "I've had 100 sorries. I've had sorries in the form of Cartier bracelets and sorries in the form of weekend trips to Paris. They don't mean anything anymore." She picked up the cast iron skillet, which was still warm. "You have 60 minutes, Joshua. At 8 a.m., my lawyer is scheduled to call the board of directors. He has copies of everything in that envelope. The embezzlement, the affair, the hush money. Your legacy will be over before the market opens." Joshua looked up, panic flaring in his eyes. "Mather, you can't. You'll destroy everything. We'll lose everything. I've already lost everything," she screamed, the sound echoing through the empty penthouse. "I lost my husband. I lost my safety. I lost myself. The only thing left to lose is this glass cage." She set the skillet down with a deafening thud. "Unless," she said, her voice dropping back to a terrifying calm. "Unless what?" Joshua asked, clinging to the word like a man overboard clinging to a jagged rock. "Unless you do exactly what I say. No lawyers. No PR teams. No lies. You're going to call that girl, and you're going to provide for that child through a legal trust, but you're never going to see her again. Then, you're going to step down as CEO. Effective immediately. You're going to cite personal health reasons. And then, you're going to get into the car with me, and we're going to a place where no one knows who Joshua Miller is." Joshua stared at her. "Step down? Mather, that company is my life." "No," she said, pointing to the bruise. "That was your life. The company was just the drug you used to forget it." She looked at the clock on the wall. 7:12 a.m. "You have 48 minutes left, Joshua. Eat your breakfast. It's the last one you're going to have in this house." The 48 minutes ticking down on the kitchen clock felt like the steady drip of an 4 bag, measured, clinical, and life-altering. Joshua sat slumped at the marble island, the The billionaire titan of industry reduced to a man staring at a cold plate of grease and memories. He hadn't touched the bacon again. He couldn't. Every time the scent of the hickory smoke hit his nostrils, it felt like he was being dragged backward through time, forced to confront the version of himself that still had a soul. Mather didn't hover. She began to clean. It was a rhythmic, almost meditative action. She wiped the counters. She put the milk back in the refrigerator. She moved with a terrifyingly calm purpose. She was no longer acting like a victim waiting for the next blow. She was acting like a person who had already survived the worst and was now just clearing away the debris. "I can't just step down, Mather," Joshua finally said, his voice raspy. "The stock will plummet. The board, they'll think I'm being forced out. They'll dig. If they find even a hint of the offshore account, they'll come for my head. They'll come for your head, too. You're tied to those accounts." Mather stopped wiping the quartz. She leaned her weight onto her hands and looked at him. "Let them dig, Joshua. Let them take the money. Let them take the penthouse and the Hamptons house and the jet. Do you really think I care about the stock price of a company that cost me my marriage? It's not just about the money." Joshua snapped, a flash of his old fire returning. "It's about what I built. It's about the Miller name. My father died with nothing but a toolbox and a debt to the IRS. I made that name mean something in this city." "You made it mean fear," Mather countered. "You made it mean untouchable. But nobody is untouchable, Joshua. Not even you." Before we go any further into Joshua's choice, I want to ask you a question. If you had to choose between keeping everything you ever worked for or keeping the one person who truly knows you, which would you pick? It sounds like an easy answer, but when the world is at your feet, is it? Tell me in the comments. I'm curious to see where you draw the line. Joshua looked away from her, his gaze landing on the pile of photos scattered across the counter. He reached out and picked up the sonogram. It was a grainy, black and white image, the universal symbol of a beginning. But for him, it was a symbol of an end. "I never meant for this to happen," he whispered. "With her, with Sarah? It was easy. She didn't know the Brooklyn Joshua. She didn't remind me of the days I had to count quarters for the subway. She just saw the man who could buy the world. And for a while, I liked being that man. I liked not being judged for my ambition." "I never judged your ambition, Joshua. I judged your cruelty," Mather said. She walked over and stood behind him, though she didn't touch him. "Ambition is wanting to be better. Cruelty is thinking everyone else is beneath you because you are." "She's 4 months along," Joshua said, his voice breaking. The confession was finally pouring out, the dam of his ego bursting. She started asking for things. Not just money. She wanted a seat on the board. She wanted a public acknowledgement. She told me if I didn't give her a title, she'd go to the post. I was terrified, Mather. Not of losing her, but of losing the image. I started the offshore transfers to buy her off, to get her to go to London. But she wouldn't go. Mather listened, her heart feeling like a piece of glass being slowly ground into sand. Hearing him say the words was different than knowing the truth. The words had weight. The words had a heartbeat. "And last night?" Mather asked, her voice trembling despite her resolve. "When you saw me looking at that sonogram on your desk, why did you hit me? Was it because you hated me for knowing, or because you hated yourself?" Joshua's head dropped. A single tear fell onto the cold sourdough toast. "Because I saw my reflection in your eyes, and for the first time in 10 years, I saw a monster. I wanted to break the mirror. I wanted to stop you from seeing me. You can't stop the truth by breaking the person who tells it," she said. Joshua stood up, his legs shaking. He walked to the window, the same place Mather had stood earlier. He looked out at the city he had conquered, the skyline that bore his name in neon on 3 different buildings. It all looked like a graveyard to him now. Every skyscraper was a headstone for a piece of himself he had buried on his way to the top. "If I do this," he said, turning back to her, "if I sign the papers, if I step down, what happens to us?" "I don't know," Mather said honestly. "I don't know if us exists anymore. But I know that if you don't do it, you won't exist. You'll just be another headline. Another billionaire who fell because he thought he was a god." She walked to the living room and returned with a laptop. She set it on the island and opened a file. It was a pre-drafted resignation letter. It was simple, elegant, and devastating. "Type it, Joshua. Send it to the board chair. Now." Joshua stared at the keyboard. His fingers, which had signed billion-dollar mergers without a tremor, were shaking so violently He had to grip the edge of the island. He looked at the clock. 7:38 a.m. The unraveling was no longer a threat. It was a physical process. Joshua felt the layers of his identity being stripped away. The CEO, the billionaire, the power broker, the man who has everything. One by one, those titles were dissolving, leaving only the bruised husband and the failing human. He began to type. To the board of directors, Miller Global Holdings. Effective immediately, I am resigning from my position as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman. Each keystroke felt like a nail in a coffin. But as he wrote, something strange happened. The crushing weight in his chest, the one he'd carried for years, the one he'd drowned in scotch and silenced with rage, began to lift. It was replaced by a terrifying, hollow lightness. He finished the letter and hovered his mouse over the send button. Once I click this, Mather, there's no going back. The sharks will come. The press will be at the door in 20 minutes. Sarah will call. My lawyers will lose their minds. Everything we have is going to be scrutinized. Good, Mather said. Let them see it all. There's nothing left to hide. Joshua looked at her. He saw the bruise again, the one she had wiped the makeup off of. It was a dark, ugly mark of his failure. But he also saw her eyes. For the first time in a decade, they weren't clouded with fear. They were clear. They were the emeralds he had fallen in love with in that drafty Brooklyn apartment. He clicked send. The sound of the whoosh as the email left his outbox sounded like a guillotine blade dropping. For a moment, the world was silent. Then, Joshua's phone, which was sitting on the counter, began to vibrate. Then it rang. Then it vibrated again. A barrage of notifications started lighting up the screen like a firework display. The board chair, the head of PR, his lead counsel. Joshua didn't pick it up. He watched the phone dance across the marble until it fell off the edge and hit the floor with a dull thud. It's done, he whispered. Not yet, Mather said. Now comes the hard part. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and drew the heavy, motorized curtains. One by one, the segments of the Manhattan skyline vanished, replaced by a soft, beige fabric. She was shutting out the world he had spent his life trying to impress. We have 20 minutes before the security downstairs realizes they can't stop the reporters, Mather said. In those 20 minutes, you're going to tell me everything. Not just about Sarah. About the money. About the other women. About the moments you decided that I didn't matter anymore. If we are going to build anything, even if it's just a bridge to a peaceful divorce, I need the truth to be the only thing left in this room. Joshua sank to the floor, leaning his back against the cold quartz island. He didn't look like a billionaire anymore. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck and had just realized he was the only one on the beach. Where do I start? He asked. Start with the first time you lied to me, Mather said, sitting on the floor across from him. Start with the moment you decided that being Joshua Miller was more important than being my husband. And so, the unraveling began in earnest. For the next hour, as the world outside began to burn with the news of his resignation, Joshua spoke. He told her about the first affair, a brief, meaningless encounter in Hong Kong 5 years ago. He told her about the thrill of the power, the way it acted like a drug, making him feel like the rules of morality didn't apply to a man of his stature. He told her about the offshore accounts, the way he had hidden money not just from the government, but from her, as a way of ensuring he always had an exit strategy. He told her about the resentment he felt every time she looked at him with love, because that love reminded him of the man he was killing off to become a titan. It was a brutal, ugly, and pathetic story. Mather sat and listened, her face a mask of sorrow. She didn't interrupt. She didn't scream. She just let the poison flow out of him, filling the sterile kitchen with the stench of his choices. By the time he was finished, the sun was high in the sky, and the muffled sound of sirens could be heard from the street below. The penthouse, once a symbol of their triumph, felt like a hollow shell. Are you done? Mather asked softly. I think so, Joshua said. He looked exhausted, aged by 10 years in a single morning. I've told you things I haven't even told myself. I've lost everything, Mather. My company, my reputation, my self-respect. You didn't lose your self-respect, Joshua, she said, reaching out. And for the first time, she touched his hand. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold marble. You threw it away a long time ago. Today was just the day you finally admitted it was gone. She stood up and held out her hand to him. Come on. We need to leave. The back elevator leads to the service entrance. My car is parked 3 blocks away. Where are we going? Joshua asked, taking her hand and letting her pull him to his feet. To a place where nobody wants anything from you, she said. And to a place where I can decide if I ever want to see you again without a lawyer present. As they walked toward the service door, Joshua stopped. He looked back at the kitchen island, at the cold breakfast, the scattered photos, and the heavy cast-iron skillet. I'm sorry, Mather, he said, and this time, the words didn't sound like a transaction. They sounded like a plea. I know, she said. But sorry is just a seed, Joshua. It takes a long time and a lot of work before anything grows from it. They stepped into the service elevator and the doors closed, leaving the billion-dollar penthouse to the ghosts of the people they used to be. The unraveling was complete. The billionaire was gone. Only the man remained. The air in the Catskill Mountains was thin, sharp, and carried the scent of damp pine and wood smoke, a world away from the recycled, climate-controlled oxygen of the Manhattan penthouse. The cabin was small, built of heavy cedar and stone, tucked so far into the tree-line that the GPS had given up 3 miles back. This was Mather's secret, a property inherited from her grandmother that Joshua had always mocked as peasant real estate. Now, it was their sanctuary, or their prison. Joshua sat on a rickety wooden chair on the porch, wrapped in a wool blanket that smelled of mothballs. His phone, the device that used to be an extension of his very soul, lay in a kitchen drawer, dead and silent. For the first time in 15 years, he didn't know the opening price of his company's stock. He didn't know what the Wall Street Journal was saying about his abrupt departure. He didn't know if the world was ending or if it was just beginning. Inside the cabin, he could hear Mather moving. The clink of a kettle. The soft thump of a log being placed in the stove. These were the only sounds in his universe now. The first 48 hours had been a fever dream of withdrawal. Joshua had paced the floor like a caged animal, his hands twitching for a BlackBerry or a tablet. He had shouted at Mather, accusing her of kidnapping him, of ruining his life, of being sanctimonious. He had even tried to walk out, only to realize he had no keys, no signal, and nowhere to go but the dark, indifferent forest. Then, the crash happened. The adrenaline of the deal and the escape vanished, leaving behind a hollow, aching void. Before we witness Joshua's breaking point, I want to ask you something deeply personal. Have you ever had to lose everything, your job, your status, your pride, to finally see who you really are? Sometimes the floor has to drop out for us to find the solid ground. Tell me your story in the comments. I'm listening. Mather stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one, her fingers brushing his. She wasn't wearing makeup. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a sickly yellow-green, a haunting reminder of the night that had shattered their world. The news broke this morning, she said quietly, leaning against the porch railing. I checked the satellite radio in the car while I was getting the groceries. Joshua tightened his grip on the mug. How bad? Worse than you imagined. The board found the offshore accounts within 3 hours of your resignation. They filed a civil suit. The SEC has opened a formal investigation into the hush money payments. And Sarah? Mather paused, looking out at the mist-covered trees. Sarah did an interview. She told them everything, Joshua, not just about the baby, but about the atmosphere of the company. She called it a culture of fear. Joshua closed his eyes. The Miller legacy wasn't just crumbling, it was being incinerated. I'm going to prison, aren't I? Maybe, Mather said. Or maybe you'll just be a pariah. A man with nothing but a few million in a frozen account and a name that people spit on. Joshua let out a ragged, dry sob. It was a sound he hadn't made since he was a child. I thought I was doing it for us. In the beginning, I really did. I wanted to make sure you never had to worry about a bill again. I wanted to be the man who conquered the world so I could give it to you. You forgot that I didn't want the world, Joshua, Mather said, her voice cracking. I just wanted you to come home for dinner. I wanted you to look at me without calculating my value to your brand. You traded our life for a throne, and then you got angry at me because I wouldn't sit at your feet. She sat down on the steps, her back to him. The lawyers called. They want to know if I'm filing for divorce. They say if I do it now, I can distance myself from the fraud. I can claim I was a victim of your emotional instability. I could keep the penthouse, the Hamptons house. I could keep the life you built, as long as I leave you in the wreckage. Joshua felt a coldness settle in his bones that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This was it. The final unraveling. If Mather left, he wasn't just a fallen billionaire. He was a ghost. You should do it, he whispered. Mather turned her head, looking at him over her shoulder. What? You should take it all, Joshua said, his voice gaining a strange, desperate clarity. Take the money. Take the houses. Give the board whatever they want to keep yourself clear. I deserve the wreckage. I deserve to be the one the SEC comes for. I hit you, Mather. I cheated on you. I lied to your face for 5 years while I sat across from you at dinner. There is no us to save. There is only you. You should save yourself. He stood up, the wool blanket falling from his shoulders. He walked to the edge of the porch, looking down at the dirt. I spent my whole life being afraid of being nothing. But standing here, knowing that I've lost the company and the respect of the world, the only thing that actually hurts is knowing that when I go to sleep, you're in the other room and you're afraid of me. That's the only nothing that matters. Mather stood up slowly. She walked toward him, her footsteps light on the old wooden planks. She stood directly in front of him, forcing him to look her in the eye. Is that the truth, Joshua? Or is this just another negotiation? Are you just trying to get me to stay by acting the martyr? I don't have anything left to negotiate with, he yelled, the sound echoing through the valley. I'm a middle-aged man with a pending felony and a soul that's rotting. I'm not a martyr, Mather. I'm a failure. I'm the greasy diner kid who got lucky and then turned into a monster. I want you to go because if you stay, I'll just keep seeing what I did to you every time I look at your face. He collapsed back into the chair, his face in his hands. He wept then, not the polite, quiet weeping of a man in a movie, but the ugly, snot-running, shoulder-shaking grief of a man who has finally seen the bottom of the pit he dug for himself. Mather didn't move. She didn't comfort him. She let him cry. She let him mourn the man he thought he was. For the next 3 days, the Valley of Repentance lived up to its name. Joshua stopped pacing. He started working. He chopped wood until his hands that had only held gold pens and crystal glasses, were blistered and bleeding. He cleaned the cabin. He hauled water from the well. He performed the menial, physical labor of existence, using the pain in his muscles to drown out the noise in his head. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in. Lightning illuminated the mountains like a strobe light, and the wind screamed through the pines. The power in the cabin flickered and died. They sat in the living room by the glow of the wood stove. The orange light cast long, flickering shadows on the walls. I wrote a letter today, Joshua said, breaking the long silence. To Sarah. Mather looked up from her book. And I told her I'm not going to fight for custody. I told her I'll set up a trust that I can't touch. Everything that's left after the lawsuits. I told her I was sorry for using her as a distraction. I told her the child deserves a father, but right now, I'm not a man who can be a father to anyone. I told her the truth, Mather. No lawyers proofread it. I just wrote it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a wedding ring. Not the 10-carat diamond he had bought her for their 5th anniversary, but the simple gold band they had exchanged in a courthouse in Brooklyn. He had kept it in his desk for years, a relic of a life he thought he had outgrown. I'm going back to the city tomorrow, Joshua said. I'm going to turn myself into the SEC. I'm going to plead guilty to the fiduciary violations. I'm going to cooperate with the investigation into the company culture. I'm going to lose the last of the money, Mather. Every cent. He looked at her, his eyes raw and vulnerable. I'm doing it whether you stay or not. I'm doing it because I can't live with the billionaire anymore. He's dead. He died on the floor of your kitchen while the eggs were getting cold. Mather stood up and walked to him. The storm outside seemed to roar in approval, the rain lashing against the windows. She looked at the gold band in his hand. You're asking me to be the wife of a man who might go to prison, she said. You're asking me to be the wife of a man who has to start from zero. No, Joshua said, shaking his head. I'm not asking you to be anything. I'm telling you who I'm going to be. If you want to be there, if you can ever find it in yourself to forgive the man who caused that bruise, then I will spend every second of the rest of my life trying to earn the right to sit at your table. The climax wasn't a shouting match or a grand gesture. It was the moment Joshua Miller, the man who had the world at his feet, knelt on the floor of a dark cabin and placed his head on his wife's knees. He wasn't asking for his company back. He wasn't asking for his reputation. He was asking for grace. Mather's hands hovered over his hair for a long, agonizing minute. The wind howled. The fire crackled. The world outside was hunting for him, ready to tear him apart for his sins. Finally, her fingers touched his head. She didn't pull him up. She didn't say everything was okay. She simply stayed. "We leave at dawn," she said softly. "We go back. We face the fire, and we tell the truth. All of it. And when the smoke clears, Joshua, we'll see what's left of the foundation." Act 4 ends with the two of them sitting in the dark, the storm raging outside, but the internal storm, the one of lies and vanity, finally beginning to break. The billionaire was gone. The husband was fighting for his life. 2 years later, the morning light in the Brooklyn apartment was different from the light in the penthouse. It didn't feel like a spotlight on a stage. It felt like a warm hand on a shoulder. This apartment wasn't the original walk-up. That building had been torn down to make room for a glass-and-steel luxury condo, but it was close. It was a modest 2-bedroom in a pre-war building with creaky floors, high ceilings, and a view of a community garden rather than the cold peaks of the financial district. Joshua Miller woke up at 5 a.m., but not because a global market was opening. He woke up because his internal clock had been recalibrated by 18 months of manual labor and the rigid schedule of a halfway house. He moved quietly through the small bedroom, careful not to wake Mather. He dressed in simple clothes, jeans, and a soft cotton shirt. He looked at his hands. They were scarred, the knuckles thickened from his time spent in the Restoration Project, a nonprofit he had helped fund with the very last of his liquid assets before the SEC had seized the rest. He spent his days teaching financial literacy to formerly incarcerated men and swinging a hammer for Habitat for Humanity. He walked into the kitchen. It was small, but it was filled with life. There were magnets on the refrigerator, not invitations to galas, but reminders for grocery lists and a photo of a toddler with Joshua's eyes. Before we see the final moment of this journey, I want to thank you for staying with Mather and Joshua. Their story is a reminder that no matter how far we fall, we are never out of reach of grace. What's one thing you've learned from their story? Leave a comment below. I'd love to wrap up this conversation with you. Joshua reached into the cupboard and pulled out the cast iron skillet. It was the same skillet. It had survived the penthouse, the cabin, and the 3 moves that followed the Great Collapse. It was seasoned, dark, and indestructible. He placed it on the gas stove, a real flame this time, not the sterile induction of his former life. He began to cook. The smell of bacon soon filled the apartment. He cracked 2 eggs, the yolks bright and honest. He wasn't wearing a $5,000 suit. He didn't have a board to impress. He was just a man making breakfast for his wife. The legal battles had been brutal. He had lost the company. He had lost the prestige. He had spent a year in a minimum security facility for the fiduciary violations. But the Miller name, once synonymous with greed and a culture of fear, was slowly being redefined. In the depositions, he hadn't fought back. He had stood in front of the cameras and said, "I am responsible." He had apologized to the shareholders, to Sarah, and most importantly, to the woman who had stayed by his side when the world wanted him erased. Mather entered the kitchen. She was wearing an old sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. There was no concealer on her face. There was no bruise, either. Her skin was clear, her eyes bright, and filled with a peace that no amount of money could have purchased. "You're up early," she said, leaning against the doorframe, mirroring the scene from 2 years ago, but this time, the tension was gone. "I wanted to make sure everything was ready," Joshua said, turning to her. He didn't look like a titan anymore. He looked like a man who had finally found his center. He plated the food. Simple, common, perfect. They sat at a wooden table they had found at a flea market. It had scratches and water rings, but it was theirs. "I got a letter from Sarah's lawyer yesterday," Joshua said softly as they ate. "The trust is doing well. The boy, Leo, he started preschool. She sent a photo. She said she appreciates the way I handled the settlement. She's moving on." Mather reached across the table and took his hand. Her grip was strong. "You did the right thing, Josh. For the first time, you didn't try to win. You just tried to be fair. I learned from the best," he said, looking at her with a depth of gratitude that made his voice catch. "Mather, I look back at that morning in the penthouse, the morning you served me this same meal, and I realized that was the day you saved my life. You could have just left. You had every right to leave. Why didn't you?" Mather looked at the eggs, then back at him. Because I remembered the man who bought this skillet. I knew he was still in there somewhere, buried under all that gold and pride. I didn't stay for the billionaire, Josh. I stayed for the guy who used to count quarters for the subway. I stayed because I knew that if I left, the monster would win. And I loved you too much to let that happen. Joshua stood up, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. It was a gesture of humility he practiced every day. He rested his head on her shoulder. I don't have $1 billion anymore, he whispered. I don't have a legacy. Yes, you do, Mather said, turning his face toward hers. She kissed the spot where his brow was usually furrowed with worry. You have a life. You have a wife who loves you. And you have a future where you don't have to hide the truth. That's a bigger legacy than any building in Manhattan. They sat in the quiet Brooklyn morning, eating their simple breakfast. Outside, the city was waking up, a million people chasing a million different dreams. Some were chasing money, some were chasing power, and some were just trying to survive. Joshua and Mather were no longer chasing anything. They had already found the only thing that mattered. The billionaire was dead. The bruised wife was healed. In their place stood two people who had walked through the fire and come out on the other side, not as survivors of a tragedy, but as architects of a redemption. The story ends as it began, with a plate of eggs and bacon. But this time, the silence wasn't a shroud, it was a sanctuary. The foundation was finally, truly solid. Thank you so much for watching my story all the way to the end. Your support means everything. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.